Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brett Hosking. I'm the president of the Victorian Farmers Federation, and I'd like to just begin by thanking the Minister, Natalie Hutchins, for coming along. And uh, the question of treaty is one that's come up a lot amongst our membership, and there's certainly a lot we want to learn about it and how it's going to impact our lives, our communities. How it will impact First Nations people in our rural communities as well, and how it will make their lives better. So certainly appreciate the Minister coming on to give us a run through. I understand, Minister, you have a bit of a slideshow presentation for us.
I do,
So
yeah.
we look forward to working through that with you, and thank you to all the members who've taken the time to listen in. The webinar is being recorded, so if at a later date there's something you want to listen back to or try and get your head around, we'll distribute that amongst our membership later on as well. But feel free to get in touch with the team if you haven't found it or you're looking for it. On that note, I might hand over to the Minister and leave you in her capable hands.
Thanks, Brett. It's really good to be here today, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about where we're at with treaty. And I'd just like to acknowledge the lands that I'm on, and that's Wurundjeri, lands of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And to say there's a bit to cover in a pretty short session, so I'm going to whip through these slides and then make sure that we've got time for questions. But I guess it's really important to say up front, the core reason, the path that we took on this, the core reason we did this, and I was in the role of Aboriginal Affairs Minister 10 years ago, just after we came to government. And I was really shocked at the disadvantaged overrepresentation of Aboriginal Victorians that were in incarceration, that had extreme health, undiagnosed health problems, the fact that they had a life expectancy and still do of 10 years less than the average Victorian, that they're more likely to be unemployed, more likely to commit suicide and have, I guess, mental health challenges as well as physical health challenges that are way higher than any other demographic of Victorian people, that it was time for us to get real as a government about how we were spending our money around trying to close those gaps, because what we have been doing wasn't working quick enough, fast enough, or effective enough. And as I came into the role 10 years ago, I travelled around, particularly country Victoria, and met with Aboriginal elders and leaders of First Peoples organisations like Health Ones, and asked how we can make a difference. And the same answer came up every time, and that was recognition of the past through truth telling and a better future going forward through a treaty. And I guess one of the core examples of how I've seen that gap be able to close faster, quicker, and better is when we do put into the hands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Victoria the responsibility and the cultural lens that they need to make the change that will treat their people in a much better way. And just to give you an example, when I came into the role 10 years ago, there's a Aboriginal health service in Halls Gap that had the worst performing stats of any health service in the state for Aboriginal people attending and getting health checks. Yet it showed that people were presenting to hospital at very, very late stages of cancer diagnosis and emphysema and a whole range of things. So why weren't they going there? And at the end of the day, they didn't feel culturally safe to attend that clinic. So what local people did was to put a doorway literally between the building behind and the building in front, to ensure that there was a gathering place and a welcoming place that had cultural gatherings in it. And after people attended those, they would then walk them through the doorway, down the hall into the health clinic, and get their checks. And within 18 months, they became one of the best performing health services in not just in Victoria, but in the country, because we listened to local Aboriginal people about what they wanted to feel safe and engaged in that health service. And I think that comes down to the history of how racism has played out and the effects of colonisation on our First Nations people for generations. So what is a treaty? And that's part of the reason and a core example about why we went down this path. And we negotiated basically a process so that we could reach an agreement between the state and a First Peoples peak body, which is currently known as the First Peoples Assembly. But it's taken us 10 years to get to this point because we had to build the infrastructure, because there's no other state or territory for us to look towards that's done this. So that's why we've gone down this track. They're kind of some of the reasons why we did it. We believe that a treaty will deliver a fairer and better society for all Victorians, but particularly lift up our First Nations people and put them in a position where they can continue to thrive and survive. And the Productivity Commission, the Federal Productivity Commission, released a report earlier this year, absolutely scathing on the federal government and state governments around how we were tracking on closing the gap. We've been measuring and pouring funding into closing gaps for 17 years without making much progress. And the Productivity Commission has been looking at this, and they said that the way to really make true change is Victoria's example of treaty, and the process that we're going down, they believe will see a better outcome for our First Nations peoples. Now, if we can lift them up and close those gaps, that's less money long term that we're putting into programs, quite frankly, that haven't been successful in the past. So if we keep going through the process, this is the kind of pathway. It's pretty long and complex, but it's just to paint a picture for everyone here that this didn't happen overnight. There has been 2 other pieces of legislation, both go to the state parliament and go to elections as parts of our policy platform, to form basically a treaty authority and a treaty framework and a process so that we could come up with a position where we got an agreement that became binding and able to implement it going forward. So if we flip to the next one. So what we've negotiated is certainly a big part of what everyone wants to hear about. And it's really about, treaty is really about making sure that Aboriginal people get a say over their healthcare, over their education, their housing, and the practice of culture now and into the future. And we know when people are more engaged in the issues that affect them and they have a say, that we just get better outcomes. It's kind of a no-brainer. So this is the reason we've gone down this path. If we flick to the next slide. We've created a new representative body called the First Peoples Assembly, because traditionally there are 200 clans across Victoria and many traditional owner groups. In order to sit at the table and negotiate, we needed to make sure that we were sitting with a representative group of all of those peoples, and that could lock into reaching a deal with us. So the First People Assembly was formed, and this is a little bit about the future representative body.
A treaty
For all Victorians. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria has been representing First Peoples in the state's treaty process since it was established in 2019.
It makes sure their views and priorities are heard and respected.
It's independent, it's democratic.
Through treaty, the Assembly will evolve into a permanent body, working alongside government to help close the gap for First Peoples.
It will lead infrastructure programs and statewide events that celebrate First Peoples culture and achievements.
And will make decisions on matters that directly affect First Peoples.
Because policies work best when the people they impact help shape them.
So that's just a kind of very high level overview, and we commenced negotiations for this treaty in November last year, and I was really pleased that we were able to reach an agreement in late August and bring a bill to the Parliament in September. That bill is currently still in the Parliament to begin debating at the next sitting week. And what the bill will do is establish an ongoing First Peoples Assembly, so a representative body, because the legislation that we put in place for a First Peoples Assembly to be established was fundamentally just for the purposes of negotiating a treaty. And what the number one ask from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these negotiations has been is to have an ongoing representative body. They've put forward the establishment of a new entity called Gellung Warl, which means the tip of a spear, and that has been agreed to, but needs to be supported with the legislation that's before the Parliament, and that will consist of basically a democratically elected forum to make decisions about First Peoples, and there will be a number of responsibilities that will be handed over to that organisation as of the 1st of July next year if the bill passes and an agreement is signed. There are two other entities within that new assembly, Gellung Warl, that will continue to do some of the work that is already underway, which is truth-telling and having a localised lens around truth-telling and history, and supporting ongoing education, both for communities and across the school system, and really driving healing and reconciliation. But also a second part of that is also keeping an eye on how we're tracking as a government around closing the gap and having an independent accountability mechanism, because quite frankly, governments have not been in deep dialogue with Aboriginal leaders in the many years we've had the closing the gap targets about how we're tracking on closing the gaps without, with real conversation, not just releasing reports. So if we go to the next slide. So how this new body will run, that's all the representatives that are currently elected to the body. It'll operate as a democratically independent elected body for Aboriginal people across the state. The impacts of their operations will not affect Victorian laws or Parliament, and they will not have an ability to govern for all of Victoria, just for making decisions and having input around Victoria-based Aboriginal people, and it's subject to oversight by the independent authorities that already exist in the state, like VAGO, the Auditor General, IBAC and the Ombudsman, and whilst it operates independently from government, it will be subject to parliamentary sovereignty. So we'll continue to be a parliament in the way we always have been, and they will have their own entity to make decisions about their own people. If we go to the next one. So decision-making on First Peoples matters, making rules about confirmation of Aboriginality, that will be one of the tasks that is given to Gellung Warl. Appointing existing First Peoples representatives to two different committees that exist in Victoria already that have designated Aboriginal roles, and that's the Heritage Council and, of course, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. Making guidelines for trading and sharing First Peoples existing water entitlements with other First Peoples. So that's where there's already agreed native title or land use agreements in place. That's not creating new ones. Making guidelines regarding First Peoples cultural safety, and making its own internal rules about governance and operations. And guidelines are made non-binary so that they can be, there will be this two-way relationship that exists between the new body and the government to be able to continue dialogue, but the new entity won't be able to prevent us doing our job in terms of passing legislation or creating policy. So there's a couple of other things there. Participate in place naming of specific geographical features like waterways and national parks. And we already have a First Peoples infrastructure fund for Aboriginal organisations to upgrade some of their infrastructure. That is something that will go from my portfolio across to the new entity. And they'll also be charged with delivering Aboriginal events, such as the NAIDOC event and the Victorian Aboriginal Honour Roll. So if we flick forward, in terms of some of the myths that are floating around about this agreement, proposed agreement, we are not changing any constitutions, Victorian or Commonwealth. We don't need to do this. We are not establishing a third chamber of parliament, and we are not changing any tax laws or providing any financial reparations to individuals through this process. We're not changing any access to public or private land, and we're not changing the core Victorian curriculum. We're obligated to deliver the federal curriculum the way it is. What we are saying is that we should use the resources that have come out of the truth-telling process through URUK to be able to teach teachers to use that document, which is quite a substantial piece of history, to use that in classrooms if they want. So we're also giving Gellung Warl the power. We're not giving them powers to veto legislation, but we are giving them powers to be briefed about policy and legislation in advance, but they will not have an ability to stop any policy or legislation going through the Parliament. So it doesn't take away anyone's rights, any Victorian rights of anyone currently. And we hope that this process will continue to build connection between Aboriginal communities and local communities. If we go to the next one. So we have a pretty proud and strong Aboriginal culture that is 65,000 years old, and we hope we can work through this process to close some of those gaps. And I know that we can certainly learn more. Many of us that are probably on this call today would not have learnt anything in our school system about Aboriginal culture or history, and knowing what happened with the settlement of this land by the British. So they're really important things for us to be able to feel like that we can learn about, and we now have some of the documents to do that. So I might leave my presentation there. If anyone wants more information, there's plenty on our website called Treaty for Victoria.
Thank you, Minister. And you've agreed to stay on and answer a few questions, which is great. Can I just point out to everyone on the webinar that there, on my screen, it's down the bottom, there's a Q&A box. Feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll try and get to them. We've had a number of questions pre-submitted ahead of the webinar, which is great by members. And we might start with some of those questions. One I'm particularly interested in, and which has come up quite a bit, and you talked a lot, Minister, about well-being, life expectancy, education, incarceration, mental and physical health outcomes of First Nations people. Our rural communities are already struggling with a lot of these issues ourselves. We do struggle with access to healthcare, to education, to policing, to transport, to even public infrastructure. How will a treaty make a difference for First Nations people living in our rural communities?
Well, first of all, they've got a seat at the table in this process through the First Peoples Assembly, the way it's currently structured and set up. So, and the First Peoples Assembly have been really fantastic at making sure that they're had a presence in some of our key regions and rural areas, and not just stayed city-centric. I think long-term, what we want to see is less pressure on, say, our health services, our homelessness services, a whole range of things that are already under pressure in regional and rural areas. If we can see our Aboriginal people thriving through this and the trajectory of their lives changing through a treaty, through an ability to lift themselves up and get that support that they need through a cultural lens, then I think that is going to benefit all of our communities. Unfortunately, we've just had a really awful situation just over the weekend of a young Aboriginal boy that's been murdered on the streets of Morwell. I think it was Morwell or Maui. And he is someone that has lifted up and celebrated culture, and then lost his life in a pretty horrific stabbing, which is just awful. How will this help that? Well, hopefully, I think better engagement with our Aboriginal communities is only a good thing. That will hopefully take some of the pressure off some of the resources that already are constrained in our local areas.
Thank you. We've got another question, and it is one that's featured quite frequently in some of the questions that were pre-submitted. How will a treaty impact farmers? I'm going to ask it in two parts: right to use their own land, right to use their water entitlements, and also right to many farmers have leases or river frontages, which is Crown land. Will the treaty impact any of those abilities for landholders to use or affect the way they use it, affect their access or anything like that?
Oh, look, we've been pretty upfront in saying that we are not making any changes through this treaty to the use and access of land. The only thing that is specifically called out in the treaty agreement is the capacity for traditional owner groups to talk about the use of water they already have access to under a native title arrangement, and how they could better, share those water intersects between each other, and giving the role of the new body to help negotiate that out, because there's lots of differences between traditional owner groups around boundaries and intersecting points. But I just want to say clearly that the treaty and the positioning of a new First Peoples entity does not take away any land rights or any access to water rights at all. All of those things, existing land right uses for Victorian landowners and farmers' businesses, will stay as is. This current agreement does not affect, and nor does the legislation affect, the use of rights or farming operations in Victoria.
Thank you. Next question we've got in is around control of wildlife. What we've seen is that we have changed our environment, by farming practices. So we see exacerbated, numbers of native wildlife at times. Kangaroos is a very obvious one. We also have impacts of wild dogs and sometimes dingoes, attacking livestock, sometimes attacking as pack animals, in which case, the results can be incredibly cruel to the livestock themselves, because they don't always, they're not always hunting to eat. They're actually sometimes hunting for sport in those situations. And it's very difficult as a farmer to watch that happen and feel powerless to intervene. Will the treaty have any impact on the way we control and manage native wildlife in particular?
Not specifically. There's not been any commitments around that, but and I certainly don't see any kind of effects at supporting or affecting, I should say, production or sustainability of any farming whatsoever. And I would class that your right to deal with the pests that are affecting that will still stand. There's not a clause, there's not even a mention around this. I think it's when we've talked about this in the past, not at the negotiating table, but when we've considered any kind of changes to hunting in the Parliament, there are very different views amongst traditional owner groups around the approach. I know that there was a desire very early on when we first started talking about treaty for the ability for some First Nations groups were very keen about being able to hunt and skin possum because they spend a lot of money, to be honest, importing possums from New Zealand, possum skins. And that was not prioritised to be on the table in these negotiations. So I don't see any of that changing for farmers whatsoever.
No, thank you. I realise we've only got a couple of minutes left, but we have had a couple of questions in around, and maybe a good way to pitch this is that, we have seen moves by the federal government to try and close the gap. Which have had mixed results at times and probably not had the impact I think even the federal government themselves would have hoped for. What happens in 5 to 10 years if we look back on this and we say, you know what, it didn't make the shift that we wanted it to, or we hoped for? What then? Like, is there a review process in place, or is there a next step envisaged, or?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do review the legislation itself. Will be all our legislation has a point in time where it gets reviewed and updated. So yes, we'll be looking at that. But obviously, this is the start of a process. This statewide treaty. There is capacity under the previous legislation that passed Parliament for localised treaties to happen. And the reason I mention that is they would be parties that are just the traditional owner groups locally with, say, the state government and local council. And I think actually the kind of closer to the ground and the more place-based we are in coming up with agreements and delivering better services and opportunities for First Peoples to grow their businesses as well and engage in business, the more likely we are to see the closing of the gaps. And I don't know that the federal government, I think the solutions, quite frankly, are very localised. They're not, I don't think bureaucrats in Canberra can come up with the programs, quite frankly, that are required to close the gap. And I think this process that we've put in place will see some of that happen. And if you ask, you might say, well, what are the practical things that you would measure? Well, things like, getting Aboriginal kids to go to kinder so that they then enrol in school. And that's something we've had some success in Victoria because we've had dedicated kinder programs running that talk about, culture. And that has made a difference to enrolments, like dramatically, almost close the gap in that kinder space, which changes the direction of these kids going forward in their education.
Thank you. Have we got time for a couple more questions or what? Yep. Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say because I'm not the moderator. I'm just the minister.
All right. Well, let's do maybe at least one last one if we can. There's a question on there around locking up a bushland. One of my favourite places to visit is the Grampians. I love it in Victoria. Yeah. Am I still going to be able to visit the Grampians forever? Am I going to be able to take my grandkids there?
Absolutely. Yes. Are we going to give opportunities longer term to Aboriginal people to potentially preserve some of the cultural heritage there? Yes. Are we going to give them opportunities to potentially run tourism there and in other places? Yes. that's part and parcel of the partnerships. Does the government have a policy or enshrine a policy in this legislation to keep Victorians out of beautiful places like Grampians? No, we don't, and nor do I think the First Peoples Assembly want that either. But what they want to do is make sure that, you know, some of the best cultural artwork is not blown up like we saw happen in WA.
Yeah, I don't think any of us want that. We probably have reached the end of our time, and I realise it was short, and I do thank everybody. There's a number of questions we haven't got to the answers for. What we might see if we can do is capture some of those questions and see if you and your team will be able to provide answers to that. And we're more than happy to, we'll try and email them out to maybe some of those facts out to our membership. And I might, to anybody who is on the call, if you do have questions that even come up later this afternoon as you're going about your farming business and you think, oh, I wish I'd asked that, feel free to email it into the team at VFF at media@vff.org.au, and we'll make sure that gets answered as well if we can, and because we want everybody to have as much information about the treaty process as possible. We do want to learn, and we want to, I mean, we live in communities alongside First Nations people. We want to see them prosper and thrive, but we're also very conscious this is a big investment by government, or by all taxpayers in terms of financially, and we want to see it achieve the outcomes as well. So we do thank you for taking the time to share with us today and answer some of those questions, but it'd be great to get that follow-up as well, Minister.
Yep, happy to commit to getting some of that back to you in writing, to your members. Yep.
No. All right, we might end there, but thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for the team who've pulled this together, and for all the members in particular who've jumped on and taken the time to submit questions beforehand or throughout the webinar. It's really valuable. Hopefully we've answered some of those questions and given you a little bit more knowledge around what treaty will and won't mean for us as farmers, but let's keep the conversation going. And we're really keen to continually hear back from our membership on what their thoughts are, and any concerns they might have, any opportunities that they feel haven't been captured by the treaty process. We'd love to hear about that as well. So, and we'll certainly be feeding that back to government. But thank you, Minister, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.